With the 2022 Formula 1 season now at its halfway point, I figured that now would be a great time to rank the drivers based on how well they have all done this year so far. This isn't much of a reflection on the teams, more about how well each driver has done given the equipment they have underneath them. So getting started, P20, Nicholas Latifi. At the very bottom of my list, I have decided to put Nicholas Latifi. While he very occasionally shows some potential, like making it into Q3 in Silverstone, being P1 in FP3 in Hungary, and getting a purple Sector 1 in Hungary qualifying, he just hasn't shown enough consistency or qualities of a driver who's in their third F1 season right now. And that's why I have put him in plumb last. Sorry Nicky, there was no other place for me to put you. P19, Lance Stroll. In P19, I have placed our other Canadian, Lance Stroll. Similarly to Nicholas Latifi, Stroll has had some signs of competence and decent driving, but just not on a consistent basis enough to be placed anywhere higher on this list than, 19th place. Although Lance has been able to drag that Aston Martin into the points a few times, which is actually quite impressive to his credit, he only has 4 points this year as a resulting of finishing 10th on 4 separate occasions, which at the end of the day is only a quarter of the 16 points his teammate Sebastian Vettel has. We also can't forget that Seb missed the first 2 races this year and Lance is still behind. P18, Daniel Ricciardo. This one may be viewed as a little bit harsh by a lot of people, but in P18 I have put Daniel Ricciardo. Out of all of the teammates this season, the points gap between Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo is higher than any other pairing on the entire grid, with a 57 points gap between the two drivers. This year we just haven't seen enough from Daniel Ricciardo, considering this is his second season at McLaren now, and given that he's won 8 races in the sport before. Adaptability really is a valuable trait for an F1 driver to have. Last year we could easily put his poor performances down to how it was his first year at the team, he was getting settled in with how they built their cars and the culture, but he has had plenty of time now to get used to the car, but we just haven't seen it happen, and I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going to Alpine next year, which to be honest I think would actually be a good decision from him. P17, Pierre Gasly. Next up is Pierre Gasly. This might surprise a couple of people, just like putting Daniel Ricciardo in 18th place, but just hear me out. In my opinion, Pierre Gasly has actually been a little bit disappointing this year. He is higher than his teammate in the standings and has had 3 points finishes, with his best being 5th in Baku, which is a track that he has done well at before. But having said this, Pierre Gasly should be well ahead of Yuki Tsunoda due to him being a far more experienced driver in that team and in the sport in general. Although you can say that Yuki has taken a big step forward compared to last year, Gasly should be upping his game as well, especially if he wants to escape the Red Bull bubble and branch out into other teams. P16, Mick Schumacher. I have put Mick Schumacher in 16th place. I think people won't be happy with this placing due to a bit of what I would call recency bias. Mick has done well in the last few races, getting his first points finish at Silverstone and then having an impressive battle with Lewis Hamilton across the weekend in Austria. These are good performances, sure. However, he has had some really silly crashes this year, like stupidly driving into Vettel in Miami, splitting his car in half in Saudi Arabia and in Monaco, which really cost Haas a lot of money. Now, just imagine if Nikita Mazepin was still in the other Haas seat and had these incidents. You can imagine the absolute shitstorm that would have come down on him. I just feel like we cannot give Mick a free pass just because his last name is Schumacher. I can see Mick improving a lot in the future, but for now he's P16, and I do think that he deserves another year in Formula 1 at least to hopefully for us to see, some potential come from him. But right now, P16, I think that's fair. P15, Zhou Guanyu. Next up is Zhou Guanyu. I personally think that for a pay driver in his very first season, Zhou Guanyu has actually been very good. At the season opener in Bahrain, he finished 10th. and I was quite impressed with him getting points in his very first race in F1. Although he's quite far behind his teammate Valtteri Bottas, we have to remember that this is Zhou Guanyu's very first year in the F1 environment, and Bottas is a very experienced and a very good fast driver who was Lewis Hamilton's teammate for several years and actually beat him on pure pace every now and then. 15th is fairly low on the list. However, Zhou Guanyu, it's his first year, so this is something that we can allow, and he's doing well. P14, Yuki Tsunoda. In my opinion, Yuki is having an okay season this year. I don't think he's been amazing, but I don't think he's been particularly bad either. He has definitely taken a step forward from last year and is now a lot closer to his teammate Pierre Gasly and has actually outperformed him a couple of times. I've been fairly impressed with him, but I think that in the ruthless Red Bull Driver Academy he's going to have to up his game even further if he wants to keep his place in that seat in the long term. P13, Alex Albon. I have been fairly impressed with Alex Albon this year. He has been absolutely destroying his teammate and showing really impressive driving skill to drag that dustbin of a car into the points. Mainly in Australia, where he pretty much drove the whole race on one set of tyres just to have a quick cheeky pit stop at the very end on the 58th lap. He has just signed a multi-year deal with Williams, and I think that Williams absolutely made the right decision here. Hopefully they can build the team and car around Alex because they might be able to eventually work their way into the midfield if they do. P12, Kevin Magnussen. K-Mag had a really good start to the year, making an absolutely triumphant return to Formula 1 by finishing 5th place in Bahrain. He has also been way ahead of his teammate quite often, but he has just been a little bit too aggressive a little bit too often as well, especially at the start of races. For example, in Spain when he drove into Lewis Hamilton at the start of the race and then proceeded to not accept any responsibility for an incident that was clearly his own fault. However, I think that he's been fairly consistent and definitely deserves to remain in the Haas team. Gunter Steiner made a good decision in bringing him back to replace Nikita Mazepin, who, at the end of the day, was not a good driver and no one liked him anyway. Kevin Magnussen has also had his fair share of bad luck this year, like when his Ferrari power unit decided to explode in Baku. P11, Valtteri Bottas. I have put Valtteri Bottas in 11th place on this list, and it's quite easy to see why. He has been pretty consistent all year, with 7 points finishes out of the first 13 races we have had so far. Alfa Romeo have taken a step backwards in terms of car performance this year. You know, when I say this year, I'm talking about since the beginning of the year, with some Ferrari power unit reliability issues affecting the team as a whole, so you can't really blame their drivers entirely for that. It's good to see Bottas in a team where he has multi-year deals, as until now, including his time at Williams, he only had 1-year contracts. But overall, I think P11 in the rankings is solid, and Bottas has been performing relatively well this season so far. Up next in P10 is Sebastian Vettel. Sadly, Sebastian is retiring at the end of 2022, but in his final season so far, he has scored the vast majority of Aston Martin's points in the Constructors' Championships. As we all expect, he is leagues ahead of Lance Stroll, getting the most out of that AMR 22, which is not a very good car. I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do in the second half of the season, given that this will actually be his final ever season in the sport. Fingers crossed that he can at least get a podium at some point. P9, Esteban Ocon. Esteban Ocon deserves a solid 9th place in this rankings list. He is currently sitting 8th in the driver's standings, and he's done some silly things this year, like some of his moves against his teammate Fernando Alonso, but overall I feel like that he has been consistent enough to be in the top 10 in my drivers' rankings. Esteban Ocon is also a driver that I feel like has been silently actually really performing well. We haven't seen much focus on him, but he's always been bringing his car into the point at the times when it matters the most, and taking advantage of mess-ups from other teams like Ferrari, or well, we're going to talk about Ferrari later, the absolute clown show that's been happening there. But yeah, Esteban Ocon, highly underrated this year, and he's actually been doing really well. Lando up next in P8. He's been absolutely destroying his teammate this year and has even bagged himself a podium at Imola, the exact same race that Daniel Ricciardo decided to drive into Carlos Sainz near the beginning of the race, which ended Sainz's race. As mentioned earlier in the video, Lando has scored the bulk of McLaren's points this year, so the team would be very, very wise to keep him in that car and in that seat. P7, Fernando Alonso. I think it's fair to say that the oldest driver on the grid has still got it. Even at the age of 41, Fernando is showing that he absolutely deserves to be in the sport, with many fantastic performances this year, including qualifying P2 in Canada, which shows that he is consistently extracting as much from that Alpine as possible. Although he has had a lot of bad luck, it's clear that Fernando Alonso deserves to be this high in the rankings, based on his performances. P6, Carlos Sainz. I know I'll receive a bit of criticism from Sainz fans from putting him in P6, since he's won a race this year and has actually been driving really well recently, but we just can't forget how he was performing earlier on this season. He binned it in Australia on the first lap. That was completely his fault, let's face it. In Imola he didn't finish the race, although technically that was more Daniel Ricciardo's fault than Carlos's, and in Miami he crashed again during the free practice, but then to be fair to him, he went on to finish third during that race. In addition, during races he's been very consistently slower than his teammate Charles Leclerc. Even in Silverstone, a race that Carlos won, Charles was faster than him even with a broken front wing. But putting all of that aside, he has been performing very well and has had a fair amount of bad luck, and would be higher in the standings if it wasn't for the terrible Ferrari strategy and the reliability of the F175, especially the power unit. P5, Sergio Perez. Checo has had a really strong start to the season. He qualified on pole in Saudi Arabia, beat Max Verstappen on pure merit and pace in Monaco, where he was genuinely faster than Max almost all weekend. But since Baku, I'd say, his pace has fallen off again, which is a real shame as I was quite enjoying his incredible form from earlier on in the year. Having said this though, he's been driving responsibly, staying out of trouble, and he's been driving consistently pretty much all season. So he gets a strong P5 on this list. P4, George Russell. George has had a strong season so far, which is why I have put him this high on the list. Many of you will probably think he should be even higher up on here, as he's definitely deserving of that nickname Mr. Consistent. Apart from his incident in Silverstone, George Russell has finished in the top 5 in every single race this year so far, which is just an absolutely incredible statistic. He has been generally very good at staying out of trouble and bringing the car home each race. The evidence is in his results. My personal highlight in this season so far was him telling the team to let him stay out in Miami in case there's a safety car, which then it became true and there was a safety car and he was able to pit, which then put him ahead of Lewis Hamilton. George Russell is showing all of the right characteristics of a future world champion, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what he does later on this year. P3, Lewis Hamilton. This one's just a no-brainer really. Lewis's start to the year wasn't the greatest. He got knocked out in Q1 in Saudi Arabia and couldn't overtake Pierre Gasly in Imola when George Russell was in P4. But since he stopped using these ridiculous experimental flaws and experimental setups and the like, he has silenced his haters and proved exactly why he's a 7-time world champion who absolutely deserves to be in Formula 1 despite all of the hate that he gets. He has scored 5 podiums in the last 5 races and arguably could have won in Hungary if his DRS wasn't broken in qualifying. The fact that he started P7 and charged through the field to beat his teammate who got pole position just shows why he's this high in the rankings. P2, Charles Leclerc. Although Charles Leclerc is 80 points behind Max Verstappen in the championship, the events that led to him being this far behind aren't really his fault at the end of the day. And as all of you already know, the reliability issues on Ferrari's side can be forgiven, I guess, but the team straight up destroying his strategy cannot be forgiven, let alone the team's inability to admit to their own mistakes. For example, bringing him in behind his teammate in Monaco was absolutely stupid and should not have happened. Not pitting him under the safety car in Silverstone while giving Sainz, who was actually slower than him that day, soft tyres, is absolutely stupid as well. And then, even worse than both of these, the absolute disaster of putting Charles on hard tyres in Hungary, despite seeing how much Alpine and McLaren were struggling with those tyres in the race, was just stupid as well. This year has not been kind to Charles, who, apart from his mistakes in Imola and France, has been doing all of the things that he's needed to do to be a lot closer to Max in the standings, but unfortunately, his team has been letting him down time and time again. Something serious needs to change at Ferrari. P1, Max Verstappen. I don't think anyone was expecting Max to be anywhere other than first place on this list. Max's level of driving this year has been absolutely phenomenal, and I think that the World Championship has already been won, as I don't see Ferrari sorting their problems with strategy anytime soon. Max has been proving to everyone why he deserves to be a world champion in the sport of Formula 1, and has actually been driving a lot less aggressively, by racing in a much more clean way than he was against Lewis towards the end of last year. His pace, his speed and his racecraft has all been second to none, and even when he does make mistakes like spinning in Hungary, he never lets them affect his race. So there we have it, my full rankings of the 2022 F1 drivers before we are racing again next week in Spa. But what do you think? Should any drivers be higher or lower on the list? Please let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching and see you again soon.